Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Bills of Exchange Act, Chapter 8231, be now read a second time. The bill before the House, Mr. Deputy Speaker, consists of just 6 clauses, and its intent is to implement in Trinidad and Tobago a facility of electronic check clearing. Before I go into the 6 clauses in the bill, please permit me to provide the context to electronic check clearing that the bill seeks to treat with. Both locally and abroad, checks have been the most widely used non-cash payment instrument among businesses and government, notwithstanding a decrease in annual check volume from 2010 to 2015 from just over 30 billion checks per year worldwide to approximately 6 billion checks worldwide per year. The volume of checks cleared locally on a daily basis in Trinidad and Tobago has necessitated that most banks, including the central bank, use a form of image and data capture to facilitate the electronic processing of the physical checks presented for clearing by other participants in the commercial banking system. The decision by major international suppliers to discontinue the technology used locally in 2017 is an outfall from the global trend of declining check volumes and other evolving technology in check processing. These changes have impacted the local banking sector. Between 2017 and 2021, on average, the central bank has advised that approximately 10 million retail checks were processed in Trinidad and Tobago annually with an average value per year of over $255 billion. Less than 1% of all checks are large value items of 500,000 Trinidad and Tobago dollars or more, but these large value items account for 53% of the total value of all checks processed annually. Of course, what this means is that the vast majority of checks are for smaller sums. The arrangements supporting the clearance and settlement of these instruments are still heavily manual and take up to 4 working days or more to complete the transfer of value from payer to payee. This is largely in part due to the fact that the current legislative framework contemplates the exchange of physical checks as part of the presentment, clearing, and settlement process. In other words, a customer writes a check. That check is presented to a bank. If that bank is not the customer's bank, it has to be sent to another bank. That other bank will have to investigate the check, and eventually the check is cleared, but it's a totally physical process. The checks have to be couriered from one point to another. The Bills of Exchange Act, which requires this process, that the exchange of physical checks from one point to another is, part of the entire settlement process, is an ancient piece of legislation dating back to 1884. At that time, no one could have contemplated in the 19th century the advancements in the technology that now exist. Given these advancements in technology and the sheer volume of checks processed in Trinidad and Tobago, the benefits of moving to electronic check clearing are obvious to eradicate delays caused by the need to still physically transport checks between financial institutions, the government, and the central bank in a digital age. This is certainly an anachronism. Once this bill is passed, approved, enacted, Electronic check clearing will truncate the check clearing process, and it is expected to reduce the check clearing cycle from 4 days to a maximum of 2 days. I'm advised by the central bank that all commercial banks, the government and the central bank, will have access to the proposed electronic check clearing system, where checks deposited by customers at branch counters will be scanned and submitted to the electronic check clearing system for clearance with settlement over the real-time gross settlement system operated by the central bank. However, the implementation of an electronic check clearing system would require a higher degree of standardization of all physical checks and security features to ensure that only approved items would be accepted for clearance. In this regard, and I am sure members opposite would have been informed, the Ministry of Finance has been advised by the Bankers Association of Trinidad and Tobago that once this legislation has been passed, commercial banks will be expected to be ready to roll out electronic check clearing as early as July or August of 2022. I'm advised that by the central bank that the new electronic check clearing system will have no direct implication for everyday users of commercial banks, including public sector departments and organizations, as it is contemplated that all current operations by these persons will remain unchanged. Most importantly, and I need to stress this, physical checks will continue to be deposited at financial institutions by customers, and it is only at the level of the financial institution that imaging of these items will be facilitated for electronic presentment, so that the person who writes the check or the person who receives the check will still have to present that physical check to the bank. But it is when it gets to the bank and another financial institution has to get involved to clear the check that the electronic system will now kick in, where, however, at present, everything has to be physical. There has also been significant groundwork leading up to the bill before the House. The Central Bank and the Bankers Association have been engaged in an electronic check clearing project for the last 5 years, which includes several stages and multiple stakeholders, including the government, of course, as it is one of the largest issuers of checks. The Central Bank and the Treasury Division of the Ministry of Finance also established a project committee in 2019 to address technological and business requirements and change management issues that may arise from the introduction of electronic check clearing. The Treasury Division has also implemented an electronic database for the retention of paid checks that I will address a little later on. Before I go into the bill clause by clause, I want to make it clear from the outset that this bill has been largely modeled on the United Kingdom's Small Business, Enterprise and Employment Act of 2015. And electronic check clearing was implemented in that country, in the UK, as a result of that act, that 2015 act. In the United Kingdom, the Bills of Exchange Act 1882 is virtually identical to the Bill of Exchange Act 1884, Trinidad and Tobago. I assume since we were a colony at that time, it was just copied. In this regard, there was little need to reinvent the wheel to implement electronic check clearing in Trinidad and Tobago. We simply followed the British model to implement this modern system. Clause 1 of the bill contains the short title of the bill, self-explanatory. Clause 2 of the bill references the Act to the Bills of Exchange Act, also self-explanatory. Clause 3 of the bill is meant to address some housekeeping issues in the Bill of Exchange Act, where in 1884 there was neither a Minister of Finance nor a central bank in existence in Trinidad and Tobago. For the avoidance of doubt, Clause 3 of the bill now inserts into the Act a reference to the Minister of Finance and the central bank, the latter of which has been the de facto and de jure regulator of the sector for many, many years. Clause 4 of the bill inserts a new Section 74A in the Act, which is necessary to permit commercial banks to identify alternative locations at which a check may be drawn on a commercial bank. This is an exception to the rule in Section 45D of the Act, where a check may be presented at the place of payment specified on the check. Where no place of payment is specified, the address of the drawee or acceptor is provided in the check. Where no place of payment is specified and no address given, the drawee's or acceptor's place of business, if known, and if not known, his ordinary residence, if known. In any other case, wherever the drawer or acceptor can be found, or his last known place of business or residence. Clause 5 of the bill inserts a new section 89A and 89B in the Act, which sets out the core framework for electronic check clearing. Sections 89A1 and 2, contained in Clause 5 of the bill, have the conjoined effect of permitting the following: an electronic image of the check containing the essential features of the check to be used for presentment instead of the physical check, and that is bank to bank. I want to stress that. That is not at the counter where the customer brings in the check. And secondly, relaxing the rules on presentment of a check that required adherence to a proper place, the section of the Act I just mentioned, Section 45D, or a reasonable hour on a business day, of course, to facilitate the electronic transaction. In this regard, Section 89A1 is perhaps the most operative portion of the bill, as it permits presentment of a check by electronic means. This will enable the provision of electronic check clearing in Trinidad and Tobago. Section 89A3, contained in Clause 5 of the bill, explicitly exempts certain requirements applicable, and I would dare say applicable only, to the presentment of physical checks from electronic check clearing. This includes, but is not limited to, the following requirements: that the physical check be exhibited, that will no longer be required, or presented or delivered on or in connection with presentment or payment. That the physical check be exhibited, presented, or delivered after presentment of payment or payment. That the physical check be exhibited, presented, or delivered in connection with dishonor for non-payment. The day, time, or place and or at which the physical check is required to be presented, and any other physical requirement which is inconsistent with Section 89A1. Section 89A4, contained in Clause 5 of the bill, ensures that the normal rules relating to the period of time after which a check is held to be valid are not altered as a result of electronic check clearing. Consequently, the applicable time periods that currently exist for the encashment, presentment of checks prior to being voided are identical for checks cleared physically and by the new electronic check clearing. Section 89A5, contained in Clause 5 of the bill, expounds on the meaning of requirement as used in Sections 89A3 and 4. In this regard, requirement simply means a requirement or prohibition, whether imposed by or under any written law or rule of law or by the check in question. Section 89A6 and 7, again contained in Clause 5 of the bill, are meant to operate as a fail-safe to permit a commercial bank to request physical presentment of a check while still maintaining the integrity of electronic check clearing. In this regard, the key features of Section 89A6 and 7 are as follows. The request must be made before the close of business on the next business day, following presentment through electronic check clearing. The presentment previously provided by way of the submission of the electronic check is disregarded and replaced by presentment of the physical check. And all of this is if there's a query. When the electronic image is transmitted, there's a query. And the request for the physical check does not constitute dishonor of the check by non-payment. Section 89A8, contained again in Clause 5 of the bill, identifies the essential features of the check necessary to facilitate the provision of electronic check clearing, reference in 89A1. These include the serial number of the check assigned to it by the commercial bank on whom the check is drawn, the code which identifies the commercial bank on whom the check is drawn, the account number of the drawer of the check, the amount of the check entered by the drawer of the check, the signature of the drawer of the check, the date of the check, and any other feature which the Minister may by order, subject to negative resolution of Parliament, prescribe. Section 89A9, contained in Clause 5 again, like Section 89A4, ensures that the obligations applicable to commercial banks in relation to the collection and payment of physical checks remain unaltered by electronic check clearing. Section 89A10, again in Clause 5, maintains for the purpose of evidence before the courts that the electronic image of the check is admissible in evidence as if it were the physical check. Section 89A11, contained in Clause 5, following from Section 89A10, provides that the retention of the electronic image of a check satisfies any requirement to retain the physical check. This section, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is extremely important for the purpose of checks issued by the government, where Regulation 135F of the financial regulations made under Section 45(1) of the Exchequer and Audit Act, Chapter 6901, require paid checks to be retained for a minimum period of 7 years, so that the retention of the electronic image of the check will now satisfy this requirement of retention for a minimum period of 7 years. The Treasury Division currently has in place an electronic database of check images that has been implemented approximately 12 years ago with the rollout of the government payment system around the same time. This electronic database is managed by the Treasury Management General Ledger Paid Checks Unit of the Treasury Division, Ministry of Finance, and currently digitizes all paid checks issued by government. In this regard, there will be no operational time lag applicable to government for adherence to the retention of electronic images of paid checks to satisfy the law. Section 89B mandates commercial banks to collect the physical check from customers prior to submission of the electronic image of the check in the electronic check clearing system. This is necessary as Section 89A6 permits the commercial bank on whom the check is drawn to request the physical check for presentment as a fail-safe, subject to strict criteria. Consequently, physical checks are still required to be surrendered to commercial banks. Clause 6 of the bill inserts a new Section 97 to the Act, which permits a minister on recommendation by the central bank to make regulations for the purpose of the Act and the central bank to issue guidelines on any matter it considers necessary for the purpose of the Act. Finally, the Ministry of Finance has been advised by the Chief Parliamentary Counsel that no amendments are required to the Negotiable Instruments Dishonored Checks Act, Chapter 7952, the Evidence Act, Chapter 702, or the Electronic Transaction Act, Chapter 2205, to effect the electronic clearing of checks. So if I summarize, Mr. Deputy Speaker, what we are doing here is facilitating a modern system for bank-to-bank communication, bank-to-bank transactions with respect to the clearance of checks. I want to stress, customers will still be required to write physical checks. These physical checks will be required to be submitted to a bank. And if it is not the parent bank or the branch of the person who has written the check, this will now allow an electronic image of that check to be used in communication with another bank. I am satisfied that this is a significant improvement. I'm satisfied it will reduce the clearing time for checks by at least 50%. And I think it is something that we need to do, and we need to do quickly. I beg to move.